Every now and then I find a subject I can really get my teeth into. And when I do, I generally don't let go until I've taken it about as far as my brain can handle. A while ago I thought I'd try making up a timeline for the Bible so that I could get things in perspective. I know many have done it before and I only had to look it up, but I thought I would do it for myself and this way I'd understand it better. With the genealogies in Genesis and the Exodus, the first bit is easy, and I got up to Joseph's death without any trouble at all. But then matching that up with what comes later is not so easy. The problem is that Genesis genealogy starts with Adam and counts up, while later times are calculated by the kings, and modern times have them counting back from Christ. The Bible mentions various pharaohs, but he doesn't normally give their names, so there's nothing to match them up with until we get to 1 Kings chapter 14. Let's turn there, shall we? 1 Kings chapter 14. I'll just read verses 25 and 26. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. Now the scholars thought that if they could find King Shishak in the Egyptian list, they could match up the timelines, Egypt and the Holy Land. Until the early 1800s, nobody could read Egyptian hieroglyphics until a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion took it on himself to work it out. Champollion used the Rosetta Stone, which had been found in 1799. The Rosetta Stone contained a decree issued in Memphis, Egypt, in 3 different languages: Ancient Egyptian, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Greek. Champollion used the Greek version to decide the hieroglyphics, and from then on the writings on the tombs and the walls could be read. A couple of years later, Champollion went to Egypt himself to see some of it, and he went up the river to Karnak, where there's a great temple to the god Amun, and it's covered in hieroglyphic stories of battles, and he found the record of a campaign into Canaan by a pharaoh Shoshenq. In the description he discovered the name of a place called Judah HaMelkuth, and because of the first word Judah, he assumed it to be Judah. Now Shoshenq sounds a bit like Shishak, and since they both ran campaigns into Judah, he said that Shoshenq must be Shishak. And this revelation gave them an anchor point to line up the timelines of Egypt and the Holy Land. Egyptologists then used the Bible to date the start of the 22nd dynasty to 945 BC by lining up King Rehoboam with Pharaoh Shoshenq. They then traced back to the 19th dynasty to find the dates for Pharaoh Ramesses II, the supposed pharaoh of the Exodus, at around 1250 BC. So they looked for evidence of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan around that time, but they couldn't find any. Even the Battle of Jericho apparently didn't take place because it wasn't there and hadn't been for hundreds of years. Because they couldn't find any evidence around this time, they concluded that the Exodus story was a myth. They assumed that some later priest had written the story to establish a background for their nation and their religion. So, and this is where it gets interesting, the Egyptologists used the Bible to establish the timeline for Egypt, then used the timeline to prove that the Bible isn't true. Doesn't sound like good scholarship to me. A number of years later, when they had more experience and could decipher the hieroglyphics more accurately, someone discovered that what they thought was Judah HaMelkuth was actually Yad HaMelech, which means hand of the king. When they dug deeper into the inscription, it was discovered that Shoshenq's campaign didn't go into Judah and Jerusalem at all, but concentrated on the northern kingdom of Israel. So this proved that Shoshenq was not Shishak at all. So the lock on the timeline had become unlocked, but as far as the scholars were concerned, the history they had written was set in stone. From now on, I'm going to be referring to the work of a man named David Roll. That's ROHL for those who want to look it up. David Roll started out as a rock star in England in the late 60s, and when that fizzled he went back to school and got various degrees and became one of Britain's leading historians and Egyptologists. He says he's an agnostic, but he believes the Bible is an accurate history book. David Roll decided that he wanted to see if he could find out who Shishak actually was, so he looked into the names of the pharaohs. I won't go into too much detail, but the pharaohs each had two names, their birth name and their coronation name. We all think Ramesses is the name of one of them, but in fact that was the Greek version of his birth name. His coronation name was Washmaria Shatatnaria, and his birth name Riamashisha Niamana. Now, just like we today like to shorten people's names, like from Timothy to Tim or Robert to Bob, so did the Egyptians, especially with long names like theirs. And so the first half of Ramesses' birth name was shortened from Riamashisha to Shisha. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11. First Kings chapter 11, and I'll read verse 40. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Jeroboam and Shishak were obviously mates, and so Jeroboam would probably have called him by his shortened name, Shisha, and that would be how that name came back to Israel. The missing K on the end is explained by the evolution of the Hebrew written language. There was a letter in their alphabet that looked like a lollipop, which changed from a wav sound to a kof, which is K. This change occurred between the 15th and 8th centuries BC, and Shishak was between the two, in the 10th century BC. So whoever translated it made a mistake and made it Shishak instead of Shishah. So if the one we know as Ramesses II was actually Shishak, this makes a difference of about 300 years to the Egyptian timeline. So in fact all the later dynasties should be moved up about 300 years. And this makes quite a difference to history and the story of Egypt, so we need to look for other facts to back it up. If we look at another source known as the Merneptah Stela, we find an inscription which says, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more," which is the Egyptian king's way of saying, we beat them. This is basically saying that Israel is an established nation and that they were conquered by Egypt. Merneptah was the son of Ramesses II and followed him as pharaoh. If Ramesses was the pharaoh of the Exodus, then at that stage Israel would have been still wandering in the desert, or just arrived in the Promised Land. They were not yet a nation at all. So this battle must have happened hundreds of years later, after Israel had time to become established as a nation. If Ramesses was Shishak, then he was also contemporary with King Solomon, which means that Israel was an established nation when it was conquered. The Merneptah Stela is not a record of the conquests of Merneptah himself, but the conquests of his dynasty before him, Seti I and Ramesses II. Now let's go to 1 Kings chapter 9. And I'm going to read verse 16. Pharaoh king of Egypt had gone up and taken Gezer and burnt it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife, which would make the Egyptian wife of Solomon the daughter of Seti. Let's go to Psalm 104. Psalm 104. And I'll start from the beginning. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honour and majesty, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind. These are the first three verses of a very beautiful psalm, written by David, and it's in our Bible. Surprisingly, a very similar poem is also written in Egypt in hieroglyphics, called The Hymn to the Sun, about a monotheistic god. It's attributed to Pharaoh Akhenaten, who supposedly lived hundreds of years before David. Some scholars have said that, well, obviously David copied the style of it from Akhenaten. But David Roll suggests that under the new timing, King David and Pharaoh Akhenaten were contemporaries, which makes it probable that Akhenaten copied from David. Let's consider Jericho now. Scholars will tell you that Jericho was supposed to have been taken, Scholars will tell you that Joshua was supposed to have taken the city around 1210 BC, and there was a writer named John McCarthy who made a study of it and spoke to many Egyptologists and wrote a book entitled It Ain't Necessarily So. He got the title from a song from a Broadway show called Porgy and Bess, and it goes, "It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so." What he said was, and I quote, "When the site at Jericho was reworked in the 1950s, it was discovered that the walls had fallen down long before Joshua and his people were supposed to have arrived, and that at that time, Jericho was almost certainly unoccupied. And the conquest of the promised land by the children of Israel began to evaporate into thin, hazy air. Joshua destroyed a city that wasn't even there." End quote. This seems to me to be a good candidate for Romans 1:22, where Paul states, "Professing to be wise, they became fools." We go now to 1 Kings chapter 1. I beg your pardon, 1 Kings chapter 6. And in verse 1 we find, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." It's fairly well established that Solomon became king in 970 BC, so the 4th year of his reign would have been 966 BC. 480 years before that would be 1446 BC. That would make the conquest of Jericho around 1400 BC. Jericho had been inhabited for a very long time, even before the flood, so there are a lot of layers of history to dig through. A woman called Kathleen Kenyon spent a lot of time there digging in the 1950s, and she believes it was conquered 100 or so years earlier than that, but even that is closer to the date that we recognise. She even found jars full of grain, which shows that the place was burnt around Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is exactly when God's word said it was. So it appears that there is no sign in the reigns of Ramesses II or Thutmose III of any sort of uprising or upset in Egypt, which is when the scholars say that the plagues and the Exodus took place. What if the scholars had been looking in the right place, but entirely the wrong time? There was a Jewish historian called Artapanes, probably of Persian extraction, who wrote a history of the Jews for Ptolemy IV, which was in the library of Alexandria. The library was later burnt down with the loss of all it contained, and his manuscript was lost. However, other scholars had quoted excerpts from it, and apparently while the Bible just says Pharaoh, he actually names the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace. He was writing in Greek, but the Egyptian translation of the name is Khnephren-Sobekatep. There are only 2 kings in the history of Egypt with this coronation name, and one of them is from the Old Kingdom and is nowhere near our time frame, but the other is the one that matters to us. Sobekatep IV from the 13th dynasty. There are some doubts about some of Artapanes' work, but if Sobekatep's reign has moved up to the new time frame, it brings him well into the time around Moses' birth. Later, around the end of the 13th dynasty, we find a pharaoh named Dudimos II, or Ptolemaeus in Greek. Very little is known about him. Apparently he didn't do anything good enough for any of his subjects to write about. But in the new timeline, it seems like he was the pharaoh that Moses and Aaron had to deal with. He was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And of course the 13th dynasty was followed by the coming of the Hyksos. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, wrote on the Hyksos, as quoted by Josephus in his work against Appian, quote, "To Timaeus," he was writing in Greek, "in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us." Notice he said God, not gods. "And unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it, without striking a blow, and having overpowered all the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others." End quote. The Hyksos were invaders. They came into Egypt and took it over without firing a shot. How did they get in without any resistance? Because the Egyptian army was at the bottom of the Red Sea. They killed the leaders and anyone who got in their way. They were brutal people. The women were made slaves, and the people were buried along with slaves. This was the punishment of Egypt for how they treated the Israelites, and it went on for over 200 years before the country got back to normal in the 15th dynasty. David Roll's theory on the timeline sounds to be true, and it's certainly enough to put the cat amongst the pigeons as far as the history goes. I must say it certainly seems to fit the timeline of the Bible much better than what the Egyptologists and the scholars believe to be the case. I have checked the facts in this as much as I can. The rest is up to you. This is John Hickey for the Continuing Church of God.